All right, gentlemen, as always, we begin with our quick fire rounds, 30 seconds each to lay out your initial stance on the topic, and we'll take the debate from there. So will New York City change Zoran Mamdani, or will Zoran Mamdani change New York City? Brendan Straka, take the lead.
Well, I'll start by saying that, I think most people feel that Zoran Mamdani's proposed policies are not very realistic. And I think the question right now becomes how many of the things that he's promised New Yorkers, from free buses to rent freezes to government-run grocery stores to government subsidized electricity, just about everything that you can imagine overseen and controlled by the government. How many of these things is he actually going to be able to push through, and how many of these promises are actually realistic? Will New York City change Zoran? I think it remains to be seen, but I think it's indisputable that New York City will be forever changed by the election of Zoran Mamdani as mayor, and I don't think for the better.
All right, Nate Lerner, your thoughts?
I think that both New York and Mamdani will change. From what I've heard, he's already been shown a willingness to work with folks across the aisle on the other side. I believe that New York will change for the better, though. He's made it very clear he's going to build a New York City where regular people are prioritized over the wealthy and big businesses, which is the first time we've ever seen in quite a while a mayor who's going to do that. And I'm excited to see the outcome.
All right, to wrap it up, the quick fire round, that is Owen Alterman, your thoughts?
Zoran Mamdani will change New York City, Ellie. He's already, I think, changed it for American Jews, obviously for Jews in New York, but really for the entire Jewish world, and we'll talk about that, and obviously not for the better. As for the rest of his economic plan, he's going to change New York either way. He's going to change New York if he fails. He's going to change New York if he succeeds. Of course, for a lot of what he does, he can't do it by himself. He needs some help with the state legislature and the governor up in Albany. I'm sure we'll be talking a lot about that, too.
All right, gentlemen. So from this point onwards, feel free to interact. Mamdani campaigned on this. You get a car. We all get a car type of a campaign. But now he's in office, and he's going to learn what everyone's learning as they grow up. It's not fun to be a grown-up, especially not in office. So how can he transform from campaigning to governing? Nate?
Yeah, well, that's not accurate to say that he campaigned on everyone gets a car. He campaigned on very practical, reasonable reforms. Free buses, oh wow, what an outrage. That's hardly socialism. A rent freeze is pretty reasonable. I pay far too much in rent, as do most New Yorkers, and would gladly welcome a rent freeze. And you actually look at what he's proposing, they are very easily paid for by very small increases on the most wealthy New Yorkers in their taxes. We're talking about a couple percentage points here. So this isn't, some massive, expensive government program where the government's taking over everything. It's a small incremental change towards helping regular people.
Brendan Straka, just in tiny details, a few percentages, that's what it's all about?
Well, I want to ask Nate a question, because he just said something that really interests me from a lot of Zoran Mamdani supporters. He said that's hardly socialism. Now, I spent the last 6 months running around New York City doing events, rallies, live debates, and debating Zoran Mamdani supporters and interacting with New Yorkers who support Zoran Mamdani. And there's this really fascinating thing that I've heard where there's sort of this denialism that he's a socialist, which I find fascinating, because he's literally an avowed Democrat socialist who seems to be very proud of his socialist background.
Not the same thing as he's a democratic socialist. That's not the same thing as being a socialist.
Okay, great.
It literally is in the name. He's a democratic
socialist. Explain to us what the difference is between democratic socialism.
You don't understand the difference between democratic socialism and socialism? Do you know who Bernie Sanders is? Is he a socialist?
Yes.
Bernie Sanders is a socialist. So Bernie Sanders believes in a government. So socialism is where the government controls every single facet of the economy. Can you point to anywhere in the U.S. where there's a city or a politician who's advocating for that?
Socialism means that the government controls the means of production. But my question for you is,
yes, exactly.
Why
so
are you
what policy is he proposing that is going to take that over?
Nate, can I just get my question out? And I would love it if you would just answer my question, which is, he is an avowed socialist. So why are you saying that
Democratic socialist? No, he's a democratic socialist. It's not the same thing. And the fact that you don't understand the difference, it speaks to
I'm giving you the opportunity to explain to us on this program what the difference is.
I just did explain it. A socialist, as you just said, is a elected leader who believes that the government should control the means of production, should control every facet of the economy, A democratic socialist believes that the government should step in and interfere when needed. So, for example, a rent freeze, he's not controlling what the rent is, he's freezing the rent and capping it is a reasonable step. Free buses, that's a reasonable step towards the government getting involved to help regular people. That's democratic socialism. Socialism is not that.
So Nate, is Zoran Mamdani on video, on record, saying that we need to seize the means of production? Because I've seen that. Are you denying that?
Sure, I'm sure he has said that in the past and has those views, but he's
and
run
is he also
at any rate, Ellie and to our guests, look, we can argue about this all night long, whether he's a socialist or a democratic socialist. Look at the policies. Start, first of all, with capping rent stabilization. Look, I remember my Economics 101 class in college. We literally learned about rent control in New York as a failure in terms of intervening in the free market because it stopped landlords from having the incentive to invest in their properties and led to all sorts of problems. Obviously, it's popular in pockets of New York, right? Both rent control and rent stabilization, which is related because people obviously benefit from it, but it has its problems. Look, as for free buses, there's an obvious upside. Of course, the question is how and whether Zoran Mamdani can pay for it. In order to pay for it, he's going to need help from Albany, from the state legislature, from the governor. That's not guaranteed, even if the policies are popular in large parts of the Democratic coalition. It's not automatic that he's going to get the green light from there. And there, too, whether these policies will work and how they'll be paid for. So, look, again, we can discuss whether he's a democratic socialist or a socialist, but I think the better way of looking at this is, are his policies going to work, and how is he going to pay for them, and are the costs going to outweigh the benefits?
Well, that's important to to explore. Yeah. Well, it's important to explore, and we should, but I also think that we need to establish a baseline of the denialism about him being a socialist, but that's fine. We can focus on policy as well. I mean, you said you feel like there's an obvious benefit to free buses. I'm failing to see it because there's one very obvious thing that sticks here, which is, if anyone is allowed to get on the bus for free, how do you ever tell someone that they have to get off of the bus?
Where do you live in the city? Where do you live in the city?
What we're going to have all over New York City are rolling homeless shelters and rolling mental asylums.
That would seem to be a relatively easy problem
to be able to tell anyone that they're not allowed to get on the bus.
Of what constitutes reasonable use of the buses. I don't see that as a deal breaker here. Obviously, it's something to be paying attention to as this program gets rolled out. Doesn't seem to me to be a deal breaker. But obviously, look, there are some really big line items here. I mean, obviously, the line item to have free childcare across the city and without having an income limit for it. So even people who can afford the childcare are going to be getting it. That's getting criticism from some economists. So, I mean, there are obviously arguments to be made against the policies as well.
But gentlemen, you all point out and rightfully so, the nits and bits of the different policies. But I suspect that the bigger issue here is what is an ideal New York going to look like? And for Mamdani, it is a profoundly different ideal New York than the one that has been proposed so far. Nate.
Well, I think, again, like what you're arguing for are things that other countries, other places do. Free childcare, free public transportation, control on the cost of rent so it's not out of control. I mean, you talk about how this dystopian situation where rent has been frozen temporarily. Well, what's the alternative? Because New York City currently is one of the most expensive cities to live in. I currently live here. I currently pay far too much for my apartment. My rent goes up every single year and has not stopped. And we have been waiting and waiting and waiting for developers and landlords to solve this problem, and they have not. So Mamdani's saying, I'm going to build affordable housing, I'm going to cap the rent, and I'm going to invest in ways to help regular New Yorkers afford to live here, which is going to create a better city for all of us.
Well, this is really the inside baseball of it, but the impact is, crossing the municipal borders of New York City. But it seems that the first standoff, at least, is going to be over immigration, or as Trump says it, so it begins, right? This is what he wrote on Truth Social. But I do want to ask you, Owen, is it like a Sherlock Moriarty type of a relationship in which one needs the other? Trump needs a Mamdani and Mamdani needs a Trump in order to thrive?
And they both came out winners and are coming out winners, Ellie. We saw that on election night or early election morning here in Israel, right? Zoran Mamdani coming out and saying, turn up the volume. It was the biggest applause line of the entire speech. Then, as you mentioned, Trump following up, of course, with an all caps post on Truth Social. They'll both want to feed off of each other, and they're both the winners. The question, of course, is whether there are losers here. You know, you talked about immigration. Obviously, there's going to be a standoff about ICE agents in the streets of New York and how Mamdani sees that, how Trump sees that, and how each are going to be playing to their supporters. I do think, and as you mentioned, this is beyond the nitty-gritty of economic policies here. I do think, and we're going to talk about the Jewish angle a little bit later, but independent of that, I do think as someone who lived in the city for 5 years and spent a lot of time walking through and learning about the outer borough ethnic and immigrant neighborhoods, there is something very empowering about Zoran Mamdani helping and reaching out to and feeling as if he's empowering these immigrants who really do work day and night, taking the 7 train in from Queens, working hard, often in the shadows, and really not getting the recognition societally that they deserve. And I think there is something independent of how one feels about his policies or really his far-left ideology, let alone what he thinks and how he seems to relate to the bulk of Jews in New York and to American Jews in general, let alone to Israel. I think there is something really enthralling about the way he's empowering these very, very large populations in New York and about the incredible political achievement about reaching out and connecting to them, Ellie, I would say despite a lot of his policies and despite his far-left ideology.
Brandon.
Well, look, I've said since the very beginning that it's not really a mystery to me why people gravitated towards Zoran Mamdani. The pain points that he's brought up throughout his campaign are very real. The issues are very real. I don't have an issue with, a politician bringing up affordability. Rents are too high in New York City. The cost of groceries are too high in New York City. None of that I have an issue with. And by the way, I'll be the first to admit we had terrible candidates in this election. There was no viable good option in this election. But my point is that giving the government more power and more control and putting the government in a position where they're the one who's going to solve all of your problems, I think is a disastrous solution. We've tried socialism all over the world. What's your solution to fix affordability? It's going to fail in New York City, and it's not going to work.
What is Republican solution then to solving the housing crisis and affordability in New York City? What would a Republican mayor do?
We need a good. We absolutely. I agree with you, Nate, on that. There is no good message coming out. Look, I don't think that the solution to affordability crisis in New York City is to provide rent freezes and to put the government in more control of housing. We need to provide more housing for people. There's got to be more units. We've got to find a way to bring rent costs down. But we know that when you implement things like rent freezes, what it does is basically disincentivizes landlords to upkeep their apartments. People who are already living in squalor are going to be living in worse conditions. It's going to kill supply. And in fact, it's going to drive rents up for other people who are not in rent-frozen apartments. So it's not a good solution. It's not going to work. We've tried it before. It doesn't work.
I will add here from Israel, from our perspective, we obviously have our own housing issues here that have been an important part of our politics here. We haven't really tried rent control and rent stabilization. The solution that's been looked at here is building more housing. Again, not that Israel has solved all its housing problems by any means. We still have plenty, but the solutions that have been looked at here is building more housing and directing it especially towards young couples and young people.
Well, building more and everything is expensive. I'm not sure if this is the best solution, Nate.
Well, Mamdani does. This is exactly where democratic socialism gets involved. Is there's this notion that let's just let the free market handle this. Well, we've seen what the result is of the free market: rent out of control, affordability out of control. And so, why have a government if they don't step in and get involved when this happens? And so that's exactly what he's doing. He's going to take a firm hand, come in, place a reasonable rent freeze. And then on the flip side, though, yes, Brendan, the concerns you raised are very real. But again, that's why the government gets involved, cracks down on bad actors, gives tax incentives for affordable housing, builds the housing if needed itself. And, really, why have a government if they're not going to step in and get involved in these situations? And are they perfect? Will they make mistakes? Absolutely. But at the same time, we don't have any other options right now. And people are just fed up with the status quo. And so we're trying something new. And I am cautiously optimistic that it's going to work.
And I should also add from Israel's end, also it is, to be fair to Mamdani, he does want to build 200,000 more rent-stabilized units. And again, in Israel, the government has gotten involved in this and hasn't left it entirely up to the private sector, albeit, again, hasn't really worked in through rent controls and rent stabilization, but again, through trying to build more housing. But yes, having the government step in.
But gentlemen, before we take a break and dive in even deeper, the economic issues to an extent, Brett and Straka, I'm not sure if in its analogy, they're the spoonful of sugar or the medicine versus compared to the other elements in Mamdani's policy and ideology. And in this respect, voters who voted for economic reasons, perhaps, again, are able to swallow the other elements in his outlook that are less of a consensus.
Oh, I agree with that completely. In fact, again, I want to go back to the fact that I've spent the last 5-6 months really going around and canvassing New York and talking to people who oppose him and people who support him. And there were a good number of people who I spoke to who supported Mamdani, came out and voted for him, but had deep concerns about a lot of his other issues, from defunding the police to decriminalizing all misdemeanors to a lot of his policy proposals that are not going to work. I think people are very concerned about what this is going to do for crime. I think we're about to get into anti-Semitism. So there are a lot of concerns about him being in office, but I think the thing that drew people out, I've been saying all along, I think what we are seeing in New York City is left-wing populism. It's exactly the reason why people came out and voted for Trump in 2016, but on the far other end of the scale.
Right. So the pendulum is shifting, and we will continue to discuss this and, of course, the big anti-Semitic elephant in the room right after the break. We'll be right back.